I don't know. Say it with me. I don't know. Good God, it is liberating. I am a towering mountain of ignorance. I don't know. We're taught to believe that everything has a reason. Now, I'm glad that we have the desire to understand the world. That results in all sorts of great stuff. We want to know everything. We're humans. We're curious. And maybe it's our culture. Maybe it's just humanity. But I think a lot of the time we end up mixing up thinking something with knowing something. Suddenly, I know that I don't know. But somehow everyone else seems to know. They all know differently from each other, but they all seem to know. What I'm saying is nobody's opinions are correct in the world. And yet it's impossible not to tie your opinions to your concept of self. And often people tie those things so closely together that they begin defending their guesses as if they're defending their very lives. In a way, they are. This is why it can be so impossible to talk about certain topics with certain people. They've tied those suppositions to themselves so tightly with knots of narrative and constructed reality and values that there's just no untying it. And maybe unsurprisingly, in those situations, the best course of action is just to be friends. The world as we perceive it, as we've built it inside of ourselves, is a lie that we tell to ourselves, not out of deception, but out of necessity. We simply cannot understand the world as it is, and so we construct. But sometimes I just have to tell myself the thing that is definitely true, the truest thing I can say, which is that I don't know.
This is the Everyone's Agnostic Podcast with Bob Pondillo and Cass Midgley.
And just a room of doctors and nurses and social workers, when they all got together and started describing what the human spirit is, it felt like church. It was so weird. I had this out-of-body experience where you had the tingles, you had the warm glow in your chest, you had that feeling of invisible connectedness to the people across the room and the people next to you. And people, their moods changed, their affects changed, their smiles got a little bit wider. And I just remember thinking, the human spirit is so powerful and so ignored that if we just pay attention to it, we can feel it. But this isn't the Holy Spirit, this is the human spirit.
Welcome everyone to episode 198 of the Everyone's Agnostic Podcast. I'm Cass Midgley. Today our guest is Nicole, who wishes to remain anonymous. Bob was out of town for this one, but I asked a local friend, Jennifer Kates, to co-host. Nicole was raised as a devout, non-denominational Christian and homeschooled for most of her youth. She gave her life to the Lord as a young teen and became involved in the apostolic church movement. In her early 20s, she served as a deacon in a charismatic evangelical church and led a home group for several years. She has worked as a nurse for 15 years in pediatric oncology and pediatric critical care at a university hospital in California. She also facilitates courses for healthcare workers on self-compassion and self-care. In learning about the neurobiology of self-compassion and seeing the healthiness, joy, and peace of the unbelievers she worked with, she began to question the health of some of the Christian teachings. A journey of seeking health above all slowly changed her view of what righteousness was, and changed how she saw the world around her. Valuing health over righteousness led to her leaving church, and she is now slowly dismantling the beliefs and experiences that have shaped her identity and worldview. She is replacing what once was a beautiful faith with personal agency and a freedom to be healthy no matter what. As an announcement, I want to just share something from Greta Vosper. She's our Canadian friend and been on the show twice, episode 67 and 188. She's developed a conference as a fundraiser for the refugee family of Sobak Paki. He's one of the most threatened secular bloggers in Bangladesh and has been in hiding since September 2015. I was in Chattanooga, Tennessee this weekend speaking to the Humanist Assembly with my friend Tad Beatty, and someone asked me if I knew about the persecution and even execution of atheists in that country. and I had not. But Greta's church, West Hill United, has been approved as Sobach's resettlement sponsor. They're trying to get his processing expedited. It is a long and dangerous time for him, his 2 small children, and his wife. I cannot even imagine. So she's doing this conference up there in Canada, for you Canadian listeners, to raise money for this cause. It's called the Lives in the Balance Conference. You can find that website at livesinthebalance.ca. Also, they have a Facebook site, facebook.com/livesinthebalance2018. It's going to be held in Toronto at the Factory Theatre on Saturday, June 2nd, 2018. Registration is there at the website, livesinthebalance.ca. Early registration, $125 until the end of April. After that, it's $150. And this goes to a great cause, and there's a great lineup of speakers. And I just want to encourage you, if you're in that area, to check it out. Saturday, June 2nd, Lives in the Balance Conference with Greta Vosper. Real quick, the second thing I wanted to talk about that came up in our talk with Nicole was the word supposed. We learned early on that we were supposed to behave certain ways, talk in certain ways, and conversely, don't behave or talk in certain ways. Now, as free moral agents, we get to decide who we are and how we show up, without any wagging fingers shaming us for following our own moral compasses. So in summary, the only thing that we're supposed to be is us. Here's your freedom, your license, my admonition, do you. That's it. Do you. And trust yourself. You don't need any external laws, rules, or parameters to guide your heart. It's not impure. It's good. You're good. Unless you're a psychopath or sociopath, you know what's right and wrong for you and the way to treat others. That should go without saying, but for those of us who left the faith, it's music to our ears, an empowerment to our integrated selves, welcoming our bodies into our minds, into our hearts, and ourselves into reality. It's beautiful. Come on in. The water's warm. We taped this conversation on March 25th, 2018.
We interview people you don't know about a subject no one wants to talk about. We hope to encourage people in the process of deconstructing their faith and help curb the loneliness that accompanies it. We think the world is a better place when more people live by sight, not by faith. Please subscribe to our podcast and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.
We offer these podcasts freely, and your support makes a difference. In fact, I would love to be making a living doing this, but it really only generates about $250 a month. And we're a long shot from, $2,500 a month. But throwing it out there. You can support us monetarily in 2 easy ways. You can pledge a monthly donation through Patreon. That's patreon.com/EA podcast. Or you can leave a lump sum donation through PayPal at our website, everyone'sagnostic.com. Our opening monologue is an excerpt from a YouTube by Hank Green titled Towering Mountain of Ignorance. The music behind it is Never Know by Jack Johnson. The bumper music on this episode and last week's episode is by the best deep house chill out music. Thank you for listening, and be a yes-sayer to what is.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi
It's
there.
working. Hi.
So, what name are you going to go by today?
Nicole, just my first name.
Okay. What do you do for a living?
I'm a nurse. I work at a children's hospital here in Sacramento, and it's actually what brought me out here 15 years ago.
So you mentioned in your bio that you were going back to school. Is that for a higher level of nursing or what?
I wonder if it was when I had gone back to school. It was a couple years ago. I just had to go back to finish. I had an associate's degree in nursing. So, I just went and got my bachelor's. As a result, I had to take a lot of general ed classes again because for whatever reason, 19-year-old Nicole didn't make the best academic decisions. And so I found myself at, 30, 31, kind of 28 to 31, taking sociology, anthropology, political science, communications at a community college while I was still working full-time as a nurse.
Wow.
So a lot of those classes. But no, I'm done now. I actually have a really fun job as a part-time faculty in a nursing program here in Sacramento.
You mentioned you were doing an assignment when you were sort of thinking about your life. Was that for, I'm interested if that was an English class.
Let's see. Oh, you know what that was for? That was for this book I'm reading right now called Designing Your Life by Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. And there are a couple of design professors out of the Silicon Valley at Stanford who wrote a book on applying the principles of design to life dilemmas. And it's fascinating. It's a great read. There's a ton of fun homework. But before you can do any of the homework and self-analysis, they have you write out what they call a compass. And you write out like a free association life view, which is, I guess, what in Christianese I would have said was a worldview. And then you write out a work view. And you look at where do those line up? Where is their convergence? Where is their conflict? Just to get a better sense of basically what your values are. The things that guide you.
Interesting.
And how you bring those into the workplace?
And well, then actually not so much. It's more what are your life values? And then what are your work values? What is meaningful work? Should meaningful work look like? What should it do? How should it affect the worker, the world around it?
So these Venn diagrams, man, these are like you say, these are my gifts, these are my talents in one circle. And then this is, you try to find that sweet spot where what you're doing actually satisfies your personal identity and validation and makes the world a better place. Yeah. And monetarily, supplies you. So those are some sweet spots.
Well, and what really blew my mind was when I sat down to write this, I realized I was avoiding this homework. And once I started to sit down and just write it, and I think I had to have like 2 glasses of wine before I could do it. And I realized as I started to write it, I was putting it off because I realized my worldview had changed so much and I was scared to admit it.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're here to talk about today.
Right.
No, that's great. Right. So let's go back to your childhood, and you're the youngest of triplets.
I am.
That's amazing. We've never had a triplet on the show.
Well,
you're the first.
It's we always used to say growing up, it's my mom's fault because she prayed for twins, and God always gives more than you ask for.
Wow. That was you. You were the more.
Yeah, we were the more. But yeah, no.
Wait, when you say the youngest you're the last one out,
right?
Oh, well, I'm the last one out, but then 4 years later they had a single, and then they had twins 4 years after that. So yeah, I'm the last one out.
Wait, you have 6 kids in the family?
Yeah, 6 kids, 3 pregnancies. We got it.
What was she thinking?
We got a lot of street cred in the homeschool groups.
Yeah,
I bet.
Well, once they found out she was only pregnant 3 times, it kind of diluted,
the accomplishment.
Yeah, well, it wasn't on purpose.
So you're how old now?
36.
Okay. Yeah. What's your relationship with all your siblings?
Oh, it's wonderful.
Are they there local?
They're all over. One's actually in Nashville. One's in Alaska. The rest are in the Bay Area. One is looking at maybe relocating to another country in a little bit. So we all kind of like to move around. But it's a good relationship. I mean, we're kind of your typical use sarcasm to hide our feelings family. But when we are all together, there's just nothing but love. They're all in really different places. So there's always been a lot of freedom to just kind of be ourselves.
Are they religious?
Not really anymore. My parents are, but my parents haven't been in church for, probably about 10 years. My siblings, one of my siblings is very deeply religious and has a really wonderful, it's just a wonderful family, how they raise their kids, how they incorporate it. I guess I'm really proud of the job that they're doing and the work that they're putting into it. But really the rest of us, I would say that if asked on a survey, they would all say that they are Christians, but it's not really a big part of their life anymore.
So is your process sort of coordinated with theirs? Have you all sort of fallen away at the same time, or do you think yours is different?
I think mine's different. I don't know if any of them would say they had fallen away.
Okay.
Even I would say they've just more put it on the back burner, put it in a different room of their intellectual house. My sister definitely, if they ask, would teach her children about Jesus, but they've always just had a really hard time with the church. And so we've been able to kind of compartmentalize. But really until about 3 years ago, I mean, my nickname in my family was Church Lady.
Church Lady?
Yeah. I'd
Oh.
come home for family gatherings and everyone's drinking and smoking and cussing and hugging each other and just being their wonderful, amazing selves. And it was always kind of, like, okay, my family's Christian, but I mean, we all know I'm the most spiritual. And so I I think they felt that, they picked up on that. And it was actually about a few years ago that they kind of on their own individually came to me and just said, hey man, we don't know what's changing, but it's nice to have you back.
Oh,
I love
interesting.
that. Okay, so this dynamic is pertinent to me because my family was raised very moderately Presbyterian, loosey-goosey, agnostic Christianity, just about.
That's
And
nice.
yeah, it was nice. I wish I'd stayed with it, but I took it, to another level. I became the intense one. I became staunchly evangelical and evangelistic. And, in that world, lukewarm Christians are bad. And so I just really put a thumb in the back of my three older sisters. And my father died when I was 17. And that's kind of when I just really jumped into ministry. I started holding Bible studies in my house, and I was youth pastor and worship leader and eventually associate pastor. And then I founded a church in Oklahoma. And eventually my mom and my three sisters were coming, to my church, or, they upped their game. I convinced them that this is the high road for Christianity.
Yeah.
And now I'm the atheist in the family, and they've remained Christians, and they've been very confused by my departure. Unlike your siblings who said, glad to have you back, they're all praying that I would come back to Christianity.
Yeah.
That's sort of an opposite experience. So does your family, they're all aware of where you are now?
No.
Oh, okay.
No,
They just have sensed a difference.
Yeah.
They sense that they know I'm not at church.
Okay.
They know. I'm sure they sense. My brother actually, that lives in Nashville, who I would say is probably on the most similar journey as I am. Mm-hmm. It was this Christmas that finally got me realizing, okay, I need to start owning this journey and quit looking around going, how did I get here? Yeah. Because at Christmas, as is usually the case, my dad asked me to pray. Mm-hmm. And it had to be, I mean, I don't know if you know that scene from Meet the Parents with Ben Stiller, where they asked him to pray.
Yeah.
Greg, would you like to say grace?
Greg's Jewish, Dad. You know that.
You're telling me the Jews don't pray, honey? Unless you have some objection.
No, I'd love to. Pam, come on. It's not like I'm a rabbi or something. I said grace at many a dinner table. Okay. Oh, dear God, thank you. You are such a good God. To us, a kind and gentle and accommodating God. And we thank you, oh sweet, sweet Lord of hosts, for the smorgasbord you have so aptly lain at our table this day and each day by day. Day by day, by day. Oh, dear Lord, 3 things we pray. To love thee more dearly, to see thee more clearly, to follow thee more nearly, day by day, by day. Amen.
Amen. Oh, Greg, that was lovely.
Thank you, Greg. That was interesting, too.
And it's just this like, whoa, okay, what are the words? And it took me a second. And it was so hard because I was having this like mind fuck moment of, holy shit, I forgot how to do this. Like, it's been that, whoa. And I was having this existential crisis while realizing everyone's waiting for me to pray. And so I mushed together enough words that made sense, and it sounded beautiful, I'm sure. And I look up in the middle of the prayer, and my little brother's across the table and holding his buddy's hand, and he's looking at me with this look on his face like, oh, what is happening? Oh, wow. And he just this big old grin on his face.
I love that. I think this is great.
It was just this little moment, and it's dinner finishes, and we're all in the backyard just drinking beers and hanging out as we do. And he pulls me aside. He goes, "Okay, can we talk about what the fuck just happened?" He said, "What's going on with you? That was different. Yeah. That was the worst prayer ever."
I love this. So is he one of the triplets?
No, he's one of the twins.
Okay. What were the gender of your triplet siblings?
2 girls and a boy, and the twins are a girl and a boy. So it's 3 girls, 3 boys. I mean, even just on a color spectrum, we range from fair skin, blonde hair to olive skin, dark brown hair. So, I mean, we don't even look like we're cousins.
Yeah.
So what did you say to your brother when he asked you that?
I said, God, I'm just trying to figure that out myself. That was an eye-opener for me too. But I just said, I don't think I believe what I used to believe. And I think I got some work ahead of me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's go back and get how this formed, because at one point you were an extreme radical believer.
It's funny you say those words. I'm like, no, I wasn't. I was just in love with Jesus.
Well, from your bio, I mean,
right.
I think
You were.
No, I was. But even hearing you, I'm like, oh, no. But it's true. It's true. You're absolutely right.
So your parents got converted in the 70s, kind of the Jesus movement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So West Coast is kind of, are you familiar with Calvary Chapel?
Yes, I am. I have friends who went there, but I always thought they were a little too legalistic.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny how when Chuck Smith kind of co-opted the hippie movement, it's funny how dogmatic he took that direction, and it became a very legalistic movement as opposed to, peace, love, and joy. Jesus is just all right. Those kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
What about,
people are looking for structure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, that is, see, that's interesting because in general, religion, that's probably the chief purpose it serves is structure and meaning.
It always fills a need.
Yeah. But to say that those hippies were like, that they responded to structure, that's interesting.
Well, I can't speak for all of them, Cass.
No, but I do. I mean, obviously it took. I mean, it became it was a huge movement. Greg Laurie, are you familiar with him?
I've heard the name.
Yeah.
I've heard the name.
So it was communal living.
Yeah.
And that was a good experience for you.
Well, it was just until we were about 3.
Okay.
And so as a 3-year-old, of course, it's amazing. There were so many other kids our age. We had a house originally. And then I think from about ages 2 to 3, my parents moved in and took over the ministry house, as that's what they called it. So as a child, it was fantastic. What few memories I have were heaven. You've got your friends. It's basically a slumber party every night. Mm-hmm. And it was a really nice house and really ordered. And there was always worship and singing and all these videos of, me kind of running around the house with the other kids, just singing worship songs. So I have a lot of fond memories of that.
Home movies really serve as if your parents were, doing that. My dad was. He was into cameras. And so if it weren't for those videos where I actually got to see myself and how I was behaving in different things, and I wouldn't have the self-awareness of like, oh, I was this, there I am being this. And so you could see yourself. Now you grabbed onto music. You started taking piano lessons. You got into the praise and worship movement.
Yeah, very early. I originally was a classical pianist.
Wow.
And then when I would play, I played mostly just mostly recitals. But it wasn't really until I moved out and started my own career, moved to Sacramento, joined what at the time was really kind of a perfect church for where I was at spiritually, and started pretty early on. I mean, worship music is, as you know, is delightfully easy. I mean, anyone can pick it up. It's 4 chords and index of about 50 words that you just mix and mash, and out comes the Holy Spirit. But so it was pretty early on that I started doing worship, really almost against my will, but it was, I've got to be obedient to the Lord. A friend of mine at this church had just gotten brought onto the deacon team, and he was this kind of dynamic, charismatic, really fun guy, and we were great friends. And he said, hey, you know what? The Lord's told me to start a home group, and I want to have it in your house, my apartment at the time, and I want you to lead worship. And so when someone you trust who hears from the Lord says that, obviously that's the Lord speaking to you. Yeah. And so I was all in, and every Wednesday night we had, I think a lot of the home groups at our church at that time had like 5 to 15 people. And every Wednesday night I had 40 people in my living room. And we would have these big, cookouts, and we'd have food, and I had to learn songs and start actually singing in front of other people. And I was so nervous for probably the first year doing it. I just wanted to throw up anytime, right about the hour before home group started. And then about 20 minutes in, I was just having a ball. Yeah, I mean, that has to be really fulfilling. It's giving you a social group, and it's giving you an opportunity to pursue creative work in your music. Yeah, and it's getting me out of my comfort zone. And so all of those feelings, the exhilaration, the endorphin rush, the connection, the intimacy, all of that, if I hadn't experienced that before, well, the only box to put it in is the Holy Spirit box. Naturally, this must be the Lord growing me. And looking back, I'm like, I was just growing up. I was doing something different.
There is something really exciting, though, about a room that's packed, standing room only, the energy and the love. I mean, you can just, it's a very powerful thing. And like you said, the only way to frame it is, this is God. God is here. The presence of God is what's given me goosebumps, whereas I think we know now that it's just human beings packed in a room, kind of all centered and focused on one thing is very powerful.
Oh my gosh. And we had a guy at work, we had a conference a couple of years ago on palliative care, and we had a lecture, and this was a big, looking back, I'm like, that was a moment for me. I didn't realize it, but looking back, we had our chaplain team come and speak on spiritual care and how to care spiritually for patients. And we're California, so obviously our chaplains are Islamic and Catholic and Buddhist. We've got one for everyone. So it wasn't a Christian group. And they polled the room on what is the human spirit. Can you describe the human spirit? And what is spirituality, or what is a spirit? And just a room of doctors and nurses and social workers, when they all got together and started describing what the human spirit is, it felt like church. It was so weird. I had this out-of-body experience where you had the tingles, you had the warm glow in your chest, you had that feeling of invisible connectedness to the people across the room and the people next to you. And people, their moods changed, their affects changed, their smiles got a little bit wider. And I was kind of elbowing my friend, and I realized, and I remember writing it down. I went, and I just remember thinking, the human spirit is so powerful and so ignored that if we just pay attention to it, we can feel it. But this isn't the Holy Spirit. This is the human spirit.
Which is so tragic, because the human spirit, like you said, it's a beautiful, powerful thing. And if we were a more secular society, see, this is where I think on a recent show I called Christianity invasive and hijacking. And this is, the Holy Spirit comes in and eclipses the reality of the human spirit and takes credit, and we defer, and we pass responsibility onto Jesus because he scapegoated our sins. So we don't have to take responsibility. I mean, we're kind of, and then secondly, we've ceded our agency.
Our power.
Yeah. Oh, golly. Well, to me, that's, you had asked ahead of time to think about what are some of the most toxic doctrines. And for me, it's that obedience is a higher value than reason and understanding. that critical thinking, that individual understanding is not as important as the obedience of the individual. And I mean, we saw that played out in church. I'm sure we all saw that played out in our homes. We see it played out, in a lot of places.
Well, especially when this guy comes to you and he says, God told me, and it's supposed to be in your house and you're supposed to lead worship. I mean, he's using that trump card to kind of steamroll you. Now, it turned out to be a great experience, but I think that's just again, that's a testimony of the human spirit, not of his ability to hear God.
Well, it's funny. It didn't, because it wasn't it was probably 5 or 6 years after that. He had his own kind of rude awakening and left the church.
Oh,
and so and we're still great friends, and looking back, like, he really was convinced.
Well, I've done that same thing. Josh, for 20 years, I claimed to hear God, and I basically imposed my will on others by using that. God. No malice whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the ultimate trump card.
Yeah.
You can't argue that.
So let me go back and maybe this may not be a big deal, but you sat under like Gothard teaching?
Oh yeah, so much Gothard.
So what's your thoughts on Gothard? I mean, it turned out to be like sexual misconduct and stuff.
No, I didn't know that, but that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
So I didn't grow up with all of this sort of branded stuff, so you guys are going to have to explain that to me.
Yeah.
Okay, let me put it in a nutshell. We went to, and this, as a child, I remember, I think I was probably 10, thinking, oh gosh, I don't know. But we went to a conference, one of their conventions in San Jose, and I remember driving down, and we didn't have a lot of money, and my mom sewed our clothes, and she made us the most beautiful dresses, and they had a floral print on it. And we show up at this homeschool convention, and there's probably 10,000 people there. And we found their girl in floral print, and we obviously became friends. And but yeah, it was basically a very quote unquote biblically based method of homeschooling your children in order to bring them up in God's character. They did character studies. There were, all the different subjects were through the lens of, well, what does the Bible say? Mm-hmm. Very legalistic. I mean, you didn't have a Christian family unless the family was in the Word with the head of the household before the day started. And that meant, unfortunately, because my dad is a hardworking man, and his day started at 5 a.m., that meant Bible time at 4 sometimes.
Wow.
And yeah, and this is where I just so love my parents and the journey they've been on. They did their darndest, because when they would jump all into something like Gothard or something like the Jesus movement, or they were a big part of the discipleship movement, it took them a while, but sooner or later they could smell something was off, and they could smell, this group, this person, this doctrine is asking more of me than my conscience should allow. Mm-hmm. And they would begin to withdraw and retreat. And it was, after twins, as one, I think, probably should or might want to, my dad had a surgical procedure to ensure that didn't happen again.
Right.
And, would kind of joke about it with all the other school dads at the conference. And I mean, he might as well have been talking about a pact with Satan.
Oh, wow.
They frowned upon the vasectomy?
Oh, yeah. I'm sure. And these are all memories of what I remember my parents talking about when I was little. So it's, a lot of hearsay, but, that was one of the things for them when they went, this is too much. This is too many rules. This is too legalistic. And then they would kind of ease off a bit, and they'd get into kind of another doctrine or curriculum, and they'd tease that out for after a few years and go, nope, too much. And so over the years, my parents went from Gothard homeschool parents to now, all of their children are grown and they don't attend church, and they have, a great little kind of home church community with a couple of their friends, but they're a lot more open-minded than they were when we were
but your
little.
parents came to religion as adults, or did they grow up with religion?
My mom grew up a Lutheran, kind of a practicing cultural Lutheran. Sure. My dad grew up in the South, so obviously something. But it really was, it didn't become their own till they were young adults. And they both came, they both really came from their own different brands of dysfunction in their family, and religion and the church and homeschooling, all of that, looking back, was their attempt to give us the structure they lacked, and to give us the context and the order that they didn't have.
We're always just sort of reacting. Each generation is reacting to the last one, and religion fills that need so often. But it seems like if they were not raised in that, then it gives them the background, the ability to be able to see, to have the perspective to say, hey, this is not, gelling with our conscience. We can leave this. And then perhaps for you and your siblings to be able to see your parents make a choice that they could move in and out of different practices, that's got to be freeing, as opposed to someone who is only in one bubble and that's the only way. That's a lot more
rigid.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a night and day. It's a night and day difference. I mean, I can look at the Facebook profiles of the kids that we grew up with, and you can just see the difference in the happiness or lack thereof, between the friends of ours whose parents, like I think of my parents, at the end of the day, they could let go of their expectation and just want us to be ourselves and have happy, fulfilling lives. That was most important. Whereas the other friends I remember growing up whose parents needed them to fit into that box, needed them to obey, needed them to be a good example, and the rules were more important than the heart.
Yes.
And those kids now are the ones where I just watch, and it's night and day. It's a night and day difference.
That's a lot of pressure, and expectations kill. Even Paul said that.
Yeah.
You superimpose those, and this is where we get a lot of people on the show where they say, I felt a constant disappointment to God and to my parents. And to your credit and their credit, and the reason that you guys are healthy people today is to the degree in which you loosely hold on to your religion is the degree in which you're going to remain healthy, not only in spite of the religion, or at least the toxic overreach of the religion, but you basically can extract some good shit.
Yes.
It's
not either or. You have a perspective that is not so restricted, so you can look at it from the outside, and your parents could when you were growing up, and that gives you sort of permission to say, oh, I can back up and look at religious practice and make my own judgment about it. I don't always have to submit to whatever the authority is there.
Yeah, you can, because, and I think, part of that may have just been because my mom was such an American Christian history nerd. I mean, she was just so all about it. And so she really, as much as we studied the Bible, we studied the Constitution and the principles of individual liberty. And so I think that plant growing up alongside, even though I've got my own opinions now on American Christian history. Thank you, Sam Harris. But, even, that plant growing up alongside the Bible, I think helped me differentiate. Yes. At the end of the day, I am my own leader, and my conscience and the dictates of my conscience, if I follow those, I cannot go wrong. And so it was following my conscience, following my gut, my instinct, that as I look back, I can realize, wow, this unintentionally, however unintentionally, has led me away from the Lord, and led me away from the beliefs that I thought gave me my conscience.
So some of the ministries that you were involved in, some of them were legalistic, probably to some degree, but there were some, it sounds like from your bio, that there was kind of some gifts, the prophecy or word of knowledge, or people would come forward for ministry. And you had what we might call empath or intuition. Yes. And it sometimes manifested to where when people came forward, or they were in the home group, they had a prayer request, and before they even opened their mouth to share their request, you already knew what was going on in their lives, and you interpreted that as a spiritual gift.
Yeah. I mean, I can think of a couple, at least one guy in the home group that became a Christian, at least for a short period of time, after one of our home groups, and I didn't mean to. I didn't even know it was him I was, quote unquote, praying for, but I read his mail. And it moved him. And it's looking back, I now that I've understood a little more about cold reading,
right? Yeah.
I realized, okay, that's what I was doing. Not for malicious purposes and not knowingly, but I was cold reading people. Like this really is a gift, but it's not the gift that I maybe thought it was. Yeah. Because it's when I look at cold reading videos now, and I listen to a podcast where these guys kind of went on an undercover trip to the Pasadena House of Prayer to get their own prophetic prayer, and then talked about it as like secular people. And I listened to that podcast as kind of from an outsider perspective, and I thought, man, like how how did we make these connections between prophetic words and applying them to our own lives? Like, you really, if you're hungry, you can make a connection between damn near anything. And that combination of being able to cold read a room and a person, and then a person in a room being hungry and wanting answers, wanting direction, wanting knowledge, wanting acceptance, and to be seen. Like, we all just want to be seen.
Yep.
So you put a bunch of hungry people in the same room as a bunch of empaths and cold readers, and God's going to be there.
Yeah. Oh, that's a big deal. Amazing. That was a big part of my experience, too. The churches that I was involved in, we'd even use the phrase, read your mail, as far as, there's that hunger that makes...
Okay, so explain what that means to me.
Okay, it's like you came forward for ministry, and I'm standing in front of you, and I pick up on, and I think even Nicole used this as an example, that she picked up on the fact that this guy had been sexually abused as a child. And so she says, were you sexually abused as a child? And he's like, oh my God, that cold reading, he's like, oh, you're reading my mail.
Okay.
So your secrets, basically, there's no way that, and this is where you're talking about the credulity of wanting it to be true. Like, there's nothing more desirous than God knows my name, knows the number of hairs on my head. He's watching my life, and he's got a plan for my life. And I need to see a sign that he's with me, for me. And so when you stand across from somebody who's an empath and a cold reader, and they read your mail, then you're like, oh, it's true. God knows me. God knows me.
Well, it's what Nicole said. We all just want to be seen. We want to be loved, and we want to be heard.
Yeah. I forget who it was, the gal you had on your podcast a while back, who kept talking about that as children grow, we all have that basic need for belonging and for authenticity. And especially if you're in a religious environment, there will come a time when you have to choose. And so it's true, a lot of people can choose authenticity and spurn belonging, but not everyone can. So it's easier to go along with a bad cold read and a bad prophetic word than it is to go, wait a minute, don't talk about my past in front of a large room of people. That's inappropriate. And how memory confirms these beliefs, because, even when I heard you say that, I thought, I'll bet that's not how it happened.
Yeah.
I'll bet, because I was a kid. I wasn't, moving in the prophetic, quote unquote. I was a kid. And I remember this kid coming up for prayer, and I remember looking at him, and I just knew something bad happened to him. And I remember, and I came up and I just whispered in his ear, and I didn't, because I thought, whatever this is his business. And I just whispered in his ear. And I remember, I think I said something more along the lines of, someone did something real bad to you, didn't they? And it's not, and the Lord wants to say, it's not your fault. And so that's actually all I said. But I mean, that, looking back now, and I'm realizing this, Cass, as you shared that memory, I'm like, you know what? I don't think I knew he was sexually molested. I think I knew something bad happened to him, and it wasn't his fault. And then he ended up sharing later that that's what had happened. And that's what brought him to the Lord, was that God knew, and he wanted me to know I was okay. So, I mean, looking at it, scientifically speaking, like, that's just bad research. You've got it's such a vague general premise, something bad happened to you and it's all, which was the sense I had.
What are the odds?
What are the odds that this broken, kid who's coming up for prayer because he's got anxiety and depression, what are the odds that something bad happened to him?
Yeah.
Well, that's the human condition. I think almost all of us could say that.
Absolutely. Nobody comes through unscathed.
Yeah. It just reminds me of altar calls that my grandfather would do, or that I, sat in as a child, and they would say things like, someone here has been hurt, and something really vague. And of course someone's going to be like, that's me. They're talking about me.
Yeah.
And it works.
Yeah. It's the hunger.
Because we need it. Exactly. There's a hunger. Someone needs to recognize me.
Everyone wants to be picked. You go to the state fair and there's that hypnotist, and who wants to come up on stage. And I mean, I'm looking at people like, why the F are you raising your hand? They're going to make a fool out of you. But people are just dying. They're dying to do it. In the secular world, in the church, they want to be picked.
Well, there's something about, so if you've lived a life of invisibility, There's nothing worse than being ignored. Loved or hated is better than being ignored, because at least you acknowledge my existence. So a person who just feels run over roughshod or whatever, and so they go, literally, it's not even just going to a place where the prophet's going to call you out or whatever, but even if you're at an event and there's a door prize and you win, that feels so good.
Yeah.
You're special. It does. And I mean, you're pretty much describing my salvation experience. Like I was a teenager. I was an insecure homeschooler, and Jesus was the ultimate cool kid.
He tapped your shoulder.
And he
picked you for the team.
He picked me. And not only did he pick me, he loved me and he wanted me and he died for me. And he wrote this great book for me. And anytime I wanted, I could just spend time with him. And when people were mean to me and when people didn't understand me and when I had feelings that were complex, I could just blame him for them. And he would give me, he'd give me this great little fence to hide behind.
And guidance. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, and so you could open up the Bible, and boy,
there'd be something there.
There's some direction. Yeah. Thank you.
And sometimes there was. I mean, there were times where I'd say, "Oh God, I really need to hear from you," and I'd open up the Bible, and it would just be like an arrow to the heart.
Yeah.
Or there's other times I'd open it up, and it would just. I remember one time opening it up, and I was feeling really depressed because my house was dirty, and I was trying to be a good grown up, 22, 23, and I open up the Bible, God, I just need to hear from you. I just need to hear from you, God.
We used to call that the magic book. We'd open it up.
It was. Well, because it worked for me one time, so naturally.
What about this time?
I opened it up to the verse and it said, therefore I will call her Rahab the do-nothing.
Oh, no.
And I was already feeling depressed, literally, because I wasn't keeping my house clean and I was watching Netflix.
You're a do-nothing.
Oh, and I just thought, okay, all right, doesn't work all the time. But then there was that thought in the back of my mind, but what if it did?
Well, and you're talking to that kid and you say, something bad happened to you and it's not your fault. I mean, I'm thinking Good Will Hunting.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not your fault.
Before the movie had come out, so
it's a textbook psychological healer.
Yeah.
It's not your fault. It's not your fault.
Yeah.
It's not your fault. Yeah. And next thing you know, Matt Damon is in tears, right?
Yeah. It was so, and I was 13 when this happened. I didn't. And so looking back, I can see now, this is just kind of how I was wired for whatever reason.
It's the ultimate confirmation bias.
Exactly. Yes. And, shockingly, as a profession, I'm a nurse, and that's what I do. So I'm drawn to things, but.
Well, and that empathy skill you have is coming in handy.
Yeah.
But to be able to own it now instead of assigning it to someone else, that it is you. You're the one that's empathetic.
It's so much more, it feels so much more powerful now, to be able to move around in the world as me and not just
as a tool.
Yes.
Now, Nicole, that sounds like pride. You got to stay humble and you got to give God glory, because if you start robbing him of his glory, he's a jealous God.
Well, you know what? Here's, I'll take it here, Cass. You say rob him of his glory, then this will happen. But really the way I thought it, well, if I rob him of his glory, I'm robbing myself of my joy. Yeah. It's really me, at the end of the day, I'm hurting. My belief was that pride at the end of the day, like I didn't think of God as greedy. Now I look back at some stuff and I'm like, oh, geez, man, like cut people some slack. But
he's an attention whore.
It was my own joy. It was my own joy. I was going to sacrifice, if I was proud, if I was self-focused, you know, because what don't we all know that I'm saying this tongue in cheek, obviously, but the ultimate joy, the ultimate fulfillment is in laying down your life for someone else and in giving everything you have to someone else.
I think of that passage. It's better to obey is better than sacrifice.
Yeah.
And you were talking earlier on about the emphasis on obedience, and that was the key to getting joy. Was the more you were in line with God's will, the more that he shined his face upon you.
Yeah. How many 3-year-olds has that worked for, though? Like, you think about it, like a 3-year-old is just the perfect perfect little example of everything we are as a human being. And you try and force obedience onto a 3-year-old, and you watch what happens to their sense of self.
The wag of the finger is never as effective as just loving them and letting love foster their own desire to aim a little higher, as opposed to you erecting a high jump bar and say, you got to be this before you're really one of us or something.
Yeah, exactly.
So in your bio, it's kind of like only 3 months that you have acknowledged that I may be an atheist or an agnostic or just a secular humanist as opposed to, a spirit-filled believer. And yet, that's mostly just come to the fore, but it's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, it's been going on. It's been going on for probably about 3.5, 4 years. Yeah. But it's really just been even agreeing to, even when you asked me to come on the podcast, I thought, well, no, I can't do that because that's for agnostics.
Yeah, and I think, what was it I asked you? How long ago did I ask you originally?
You asked me, I'd have to look at my phone, but you asked me a couple months ago, and I had a near panic attack and just totally, as grown-ups do, totally ignored you. I think it was in February, I texted you about joining the support group. And then I think it was in mid-February that when you sent me the booking letter, I went, okay, nope. So.
Well, I didn't mean to give you a panic attack.
It wasn't your fault. It's that, and that's what I realized, having set up my own internal thought police and having a relationship with God that judged and assessed everything I did, it caused me to compartmentalize my feelings and to compartmentalize what I believe versus what I should believe, how I feel, how I should feel. And so, what happens when you judge something, you set it aside. You say, okay, this doesn't belong. We saw this in the church. If someone was judged, they're kind of removed from the community. And I found that's happened within my own sense of self, my own personhood so many times that I'm not in touch with how I actually feel about things.
You're shunning
and what
yourself.
I actually see myself. And it's like I'm taking these pieces that I'm having to actually put them together and connect the dots.
Yeah.
It's because I've spent all of my formative years boxing things and putting them into separate places, because they're either, not appropriate or not helpful or not godly. And lost sight of that ability to check in and how do I actually feel about this? A very, very fractured self-awareness. So I think that's why, even though if I look back rationally, this has been a process that's taken years, but it's only occurred to me 3 months ago.
It's hindsight.
Yeah.
And to label, to take on that, it's, I remember a friend introducing me at a wedding one time and saying that I was a writer. And I was like, what? And she was like, well, you write books. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I guess that makes me a writer. And so for Cass to ask you to come on and you're like, wait, but that's for agnostics. And then to be like, wait, maybe that's what I am.
Well, going back to a show that you referred to, Nicole, as the guest was Shanna.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And she was referring to this thing that two deeply held and inherent human needs is to belong and to be authentic. Mm-hmm. And ideally, you find a space in your life where you can be both. But in the church and in a lot of toxic, social constructs, even the family can force you to choose one or the other. And that was a great epiphany. And I know a lot of listeners have really benefited from that aha moment. Yeah. It's like, oh, I wanted to be authentic, but I knew if I did, I wouldn't belong. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to belong, but if I knew I did, I'd have to be disingenuous. And this is a very divisive, self-divisive thing. So one of the words that she kept bringing up, if I'm not mistaken, is integrated. And you're talking about your compartments, and the work that you're doing now internally is that you're getting honest with what is true about Nicole.
Yes.
And what was imposed on me, or that I adopted, that was external. And I had this compartment of where, okay, this is what God wants, but then there's this part that Nicole wants, and you're starting to integrate that, and that's hard work.
It's very hard work. And I think for me, it's been hard because I had such a loving view of God.
Yeah.
It's easier. And the example that's coming to mind, unfortunately, is probably more crass and vulgar, but there's two types of pimps in human trafficking. They call them the finesse pimp and the gorilla pimp. And the gorilla pimp is the guy that will just assault, drug, and abduct a woman and then start trafficking her. And the other kind is a finesse pimp who presents himself as a boyfriend and will woo and soothe and shower with gifts. And it's a long con. I mean, it's months, it's years sometimes of multiple women at once, and targeted women who are insecure and lonely and looking. And over time, after he develops a loving relationship or a form of a loving relationship, well then, hey, there's just this one favor I wanted you to do, or there's this one thing I want you to do, until eventually they are his and he can do whatever he wants. He can traffic them however he wants. And it's a horrific problem right now, especially in California. And so what I've learned in some of the courses that we've had at the hospital I work at, is we've tried to get a better understanding on recognizing victims of human trafficking, is that a woman who's been a victim of a finesse pimp is almost impossible to rescue. It has to be done on her own consent, because a woman who is a victim of a gorilla pimp is at least able at some level to recognize something wrong has been done to me and I am a victim. And so I need help. Even at a primal level, sometimes it's still, even that is difficult. There's still feelings of guilt and helplessness. But a woman who is a victim of a finesse pimp, I remember a social worker saying it takes years for them to even begin to acknowledge that they were a victim, let alone get help. It just takes years to say I was a victim, because it wasn't a pimp, it was their boyfriend. Mm-hmm. And they call them their boyfriend, so much so that cops now, by and large, if they're asking a woman that they suspect of being a victim of human trafficking who her pimp is, they don't use that word anymore. They use the phrase boyfriend. They say, who's your boyfriend?
Mm.
Wow.
Well, there's two things. When the victim of a gorilla, she feels victimized and she feels unworthy. She feels dirty. Whereas if the finesse victim doesn't feel like a victim, feels validated by the whole thing, and feels beautiful, like she feels she's been praised for her skill, her gifts, her body. And so, it's a very different thing. And I just want to remind everybody, this is a free podcast. That is some good shit right there. Because obviously where we're going is that if you were, if God was a dick and, you realize that he's a monster, he flooded the earth and killed everybody, he's a genocidal, he hates gays, but if you've had a love affair with God and God gave you validation, and then breaking up with that God,
it's a lot more complicated.
It's a lot more complicated. I heard an analogy recently of a fly trying to find its way out of a glass bottle. And it doesn't know that it's in the bottle, but it knows when it's free. And it knows the difference.
And how long is it going to bump its head against that, until...
Yeah.
So how long did you? I mean, I think your bio said that maybe as much as 10 years ago, the Jenga game started, falling.
It did, but it really didn't, because, it really, for me, what I was deconstructing 6 years ago, was just whether or not I wanted to be involved in a church. And for me, that decision to not be involved in a church was my way of doubling down on my relationship with God. It was, almost a cloistering or a seclusion of sorts, of even deeper into a relationship with God.
By not going to church.
By not going to church.
Yeah, because and were your parents already modeling that?
They were modeling that. They already were for them. It was, I don't know if it ever was intentional that they stopped going to church. It was responsive because they noticed this pattern that they would find a group of believers they identified with. They would get community. They would, quote unquote, get fed, have good sermons and good things to chew on during the week, mentally and intellectually. And then after a period of time, that's when it would start, the little requests for, hey, we've got some holes in our children's ministry we need filled. And, oh, we've got a fundraiser coming up for this or this, and sooner or later, as the request for giving more than they really wanted to give would start coming in, they would start to see that pattern, again, and like, oh, okay, yeah, nope. Yeah. and just pull back. And obviously I'm paraphrasing their journey, and I'm sure there's so much more to it, but they began to just kind of follow that gut feeling of, this just doesn't feel totally above board, and retreat.
Well, I was about to say something, and I want to go back and just, I was going to say, well, God is the ultimate gaslighter. But we don't even believe in God. Do you believe in that there, what do you stand on just the existence of God?
Oh, golly. And I'm saying this on a podcast too now. This is like being asked to pray for Christmas dinner, and I shouldn't be surprised that you're asking me this. I'm just going to say it's a hardcore, I don't know. Yeah. I have no idea. It's a deep, visceral, how do I even know? Because the way that I had to know in the past, I no longer trust. Mm-hmm. And so now I'm just reading as much as I can. I'm trying to avoid that old narrative of, hey, Mr. Big Fancy White Guy, tell me what I should believe. And not base all of my opinions off of the books that I read. But yeah, right now I'm just trying to discover that for myself. What it actually is. And I felt this urgency, and I'm sure other people can identify with this, is the second I realized, I don't think I believe this anymore. I found myself like clamoring for that same level of certainty in my agnostic beliefs.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And so just like, what do I got to read? What books do I got to read? Is there a seminar? Is there a conference I can go to? Did the atheists meet? Is there, are there people I can talk to? And
you want to replace that faith with something else. And it's not going to be a replacement. It's not knowing. It's the opposite of knowing.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's disheartening, and this is true of the movement of if there is such a thing as the atheist movement, is that you went from big, fancy white guys standing in a pulpit telling you what to think to Sam Harris, big fancy white guy.
I know. Yeah.
So you just acknowledged to some degree that you're agnostic, and I like to differentiate the difference between a theist and a deist. Mm-hmm. And a deist is more of the, God exists, but he's unknowable, ineffable, unexplainable. So, we get into some really ambiguous terms, but like pantheism says God is everything. He's in everything. Everything is an expression of God. And that's pantheism, panentheism. And then you could say God is everything, and you can also almost in the same breath say God is nothing. And here we are. I mean, trying to, and I think the impetus or the internal need is, don't tell me that my life is meaningless and everything is meaningless, and this is just scientific chaos rolling itself out. I'm as significant as an ant on the anthill out in my front yard.
Yeah. And so here's that compartmentalization come into play now, because as you're talking, I'm listening to you and I'm like, yeah, I'm probably closer to an atheist than I'm willing to admit right now. Because to me, the thought that we're not created, but that we're the result of thousands of natural laws that govern a universe and a world, that govern the cosmos, and those laws govern mycoplasm, is to me so much more meaningful and beautiful and mind-blowing. And how can you not be so overwhelmed with the magic of this world that we live in? Just even the thought that it was all an accident should make this the most wonderful thing in the world to be alive, and how beautiful and how intoxicatingly beautiful to not have to owe my life to anyone, but rather walk around breathing in the beauty of this miracle pile of dirt that I get to be born on.
Yep. We're a dirt clod hurling through space.
Yeah.
And it's awesome.
And it is awesome. Yeah. And the other thing is that when things go wrong, like cancer or the platypus, then you don't have to you don't have to say, oh God, you really fucked up. I mean, because if the world is the creation and the brainchild, of a mastermind, then he's pretty fallible.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that don't make sense. But if we can accept what you said, then it doesn't have to make sense.
Yeah. Even the flaws are miraculous. I mean, it's kind of like just that we're, like you said, walking around. The fact that we're right now cognitively engaging with each other is insanely miraculous.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is.
So, you're in this journey and you're really trying to integrate some of these compartments. You're opening up these doors, and not necessarily skeleton closets, but at least, some of these spirits, some of these ideas and viewpoints that may be contradictory, you're bringing them in the same room and you're saying, hey, shake hands and figure out who you are and which ones need to stay and which ones need to go. So I'm curious as to how you found this podcast.
I typed the word agnostic into the iTunes podcast search engine.
Yeah.
I just said there's got to be other people out there that don't know, and I'll bet they have podcasts. And so I just Googled it, and gosh, probably in about a week I probably listened to 30 episodes.
So, and then since I've added you to the Facebook group, and have you experienced that community?
I think that's been really neat. There's a part of me sometimes that thinks, oh, well, I'm not as angry as a lot of these people. So
right.
but that's just one side of it. I think I also recognize how early I am in this journey, how new I am at this. And I'm still in those early years of just being able to admit I may have been victimized by these ideologies. And I may have a lot of work to do in establishing my selfhood outside of them, and my morality and my ethics outside of them. What's
the I guess it's Einstein, cause and effect, that equal reaction, that phrase?
Oh, to every action there is a equal reaction.
Newton.
Yeah. So I think of the pendulum.
Newton's cradle.
Yeah. So you got a ball that's, and to the degree in which you were devout or bought in, or, how much Kool-Aid did you actually drink?
Oh, you mean how much Kool-Aid did I actually make?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then, and so your
right.
anger and your disappointment in yourself and your frustration with, oh my God, how did I do this? How did I believe this, or whatever? And kind of the self-shaming that goes on is going to be directly related to how much you invested.
You were.
Yeah. So our friend Dave Warnock is just really, really disappointed in himself, and he's got a lot of rage, and you get on that, and there's a spectrum, right? You get on that site and you see people, and I'm hearing, but especially the way you described your mom and dad, they never really forfeited their agency. They kept their conscience right at the fore. They led the family in directions that I think were smart. All 6 of you kids have kind of turned out holistic and developed and mature and self-aware.
Self-reflective.
Yeah. And so, the fact that you don't necessarily relate to some of the rage or anger that you see on that side is okay.
That's kind of where I fall to, Nicole. And my first impression was, wow, these people are really angry, and I wasn't that bad,
What's that all about?
But I think your point about the finesse pimp is really, it's kind of grabbed me. I'm thinking, wait a minute, was I a victim? I just noticed I was, So I think it is a completely different process for those of us who had some positive experiences and were allowed to still have self-reflection, but it doesn't mean that we weren't. It doesn't mean that we weren't affected by.
Exactly.
So as your pastor
here on Sunday morning,
and I mean a Christian pastor, I'm gonna play the role of Christian pastor. I say, no, Nicole, the Bible says, do not be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. And you went against the scripture.
Oh, that's right.
You started dating an unbeliever, and it's no wonder now that you're an agnostic. You got out of the word.
Yeah.
Oh, it doesn't. I mean, it makes so much sense, right? I left the fold. I walked away from all those good precepts and principles. So naturally, as things would happen, then of course, I'm an agnostic now.
Spiritual entropy, right? If you're not sitting under the teaching of the what do you call it, the super big white guy, or whatever, the fancy white guy, then you have to reheat your coal every Sunday, and if you don't, the ember goes out. This is what they would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And as a Californian, I could say that that's just not a sustainable practice.
Nope.
Any practice that needs that much sustainment probably isn't one worth investing in. But yeah, it's, honestly, that was a big part of it, of I think not letting myself acknowledge the journey I'm on, because it would confirm my worst fears about what people might think of me.
Wow.
And I just reached a point of thought, no, it's what do I think of myself is most important. And I'm really proud that I made these tough decisions.
Good for you.
And I'm really proud that at the end of the day, I went with my gut over my intellect. And I'm proud of where it got me. And if worst case scenario, that has got me to the worst place in the world, then I'll, using those same methods, figure my way out of it.
Yeah.
And that's okay. So I can trust being in this place. I can trust, what if I'm totally wrong? Well, I'll take being totally wrong in this place with this level of clarity than being totally right and not having changed and evolved the way I have in the last few years.
I think we have to stop thinking of things as either or. That's become a real problem in our culture. And there are lots and lots of choices and lots of places on the spectrum that we're going to just keep navigating.
Mm-hmm.
So true. It's so true. But yeah, that was a big part of it. And, thanks to all that compartmentalization, it probably took me way longer to realize how much in love with the man I'm now with I was. It took me way too long to realize, oh, I actually love this guy. Just because
you're not supposed to.
I'm not supposed to.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course not. And but then he also wasn't supposed to be godly. Because he's not a Christian and he wasn't raised in the church. He dabbled with young life enough to say, no, thank you. And he drank alcohol and he used the F word and he didn't go to church.
Right.
And so he wasn't supposed to be godly. He wasn't supposed to have all these godly characteristics and all of this, he wasn't supposed to check all the check boxes on my Christian prayer list, except for the believes in Jesus box. Mm-hmm. But he did. And so I had to throw out the believes in Jesus box.
Yeah.
Well, because those things are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, now I realize that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of, I've said it many times, almost every episode, that was my attraction to Bob, is that he was a good man. Mm-hmm. And how is that possible?
Yeah, it's not, and he's not angry.
No.
He's supposed to be angry, right? Like
ruined and sad.
Yeah.
So what do you do for fun?
Oh gosh, this is going to sound so old lady, but I love just riding my bike around and going to coffee shops and reading a book. Lately, that's been my fun. Before, when I was in the church, I remember someone I worked with asking me, what do you do for fun? And somehow what I ended up saying was something along the lines of watch other people's kids and help people move.
Oh, Lord.
That's what I do that's because I realized that's what I did on all my days off. But now I can happily say what I do for fun is just reading, and I love to travel. That's been a big part of my journey is traveling to other countries, meeting people from other countries, and just planning fun outings. We started as kind of I think it's leftover from my homeschool days, and we need to bring it back. But me and another friend of mine started a tongue-in-cheek, we call it the Society for Grown-Up Field Trips, and
that's fun.
We would get a bunch of adults together and go learn how cheese is made, or go learn about a gold mine up in the hills, and then go drink beer.
Mm-hmm. With an imaginary Fred Rogers.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Or do but it was always with alcohol. We'd do the living history thing.
Sure.
Mr. Rogers with alcohol.
So isn't that how you met your boyfriend on a backpack hike across the country?
Yeah, well, we actually met at work. He's a nurse.
Oh, okay.
And we interacted. It was always really fun, but there was very much that arm's length distance of me going, oh, no, not a believer, so just going to be friends. And actually him looking at me, seeing dogma and seeing religion, and from a place of his own morality going, oh, no, not touching that with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah.
It was his own character that said, nope, no. And just as luck would have it, I had some burnout, which is not surprising because I worked I had spent the last 10 years taking care of children with cancer and families going through horrific traumas. And I had compassion fatigue, but also more at the end of the day, I think I had religious fatigue because it takes so much work mentally, the gymnastics that I had to do to be a follower of God in that world, and to be a follower of a loving God, and to watch prayers, watch thousands upon thousands upon thousands of prayers get unanswered.
Right.
And then to watch people rejoice when the really little tiny prayer gets answered. It took a lot of mental work. And I honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, I think that's what burnt me out. And so I went on vacation and I did a little trip. I was going to go travel around Europe by myself. And I was like, oh, this guy from work, he'll appreciate it. He travels too. And I told him where I was going. I was telling him the dates. And he said, that is bizarre. I'm going to be there in Berlin visiting a friend at the same time and was going to be backpacking. We should meet up. And so of course, why not? This is a great idea. And we traveled together. And since we weren't home, I wasn't going to church on Sundays and I was kind of doing my own thing on this trip. We had, about a week and a half of talking and walking and just getting to know each other. And so just little by little by little, I had 500 reasons to ignore the unequally yoked rule.
Yeah. Well, that's a great story.
It is. It's more, you shift your perspective. You take yourself to another place and you're in another routine. And that's so important for lots of reasons. But for one, you get to see him from the perspective of, the real you, and you can get outside of that other person that you are when you're at home.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really interesting point that I think you just helped give us some context, because that first year was brutal. We got home and I was myself, but I was myself back in Sacramento, and he went through kind of a holy hell, what's going on? Like, who are you really? Mm-hmm. What do you want? Because there was so much turmoil. I had so much wrestling, and I was losing my mind, not being at church, and what's having such a strongly held belief that I was violating.
Yeah.
I went through a lot of personal turmoil that really affected our relationship. And looking back, we talk about it now lightheartedly, but it's a wonder we made it through that first year. And you saying that, I really think that was a big part of it. Was I was more myself in Europe than I was here in Sacramento. And that's who we fell in love with. And then we come back to Sacramento, and I'm Sacramento Nicole. And the carpet gets pulled out from underneath them. But now there's been that returning, and I think that's what my family has noticed. When they pulled me aside and said, "Hey, it's good to have you back."
Well, that's what I mean by God's a gaslighter, is that you do compartmentalize your person, which means you disintegrate it. Well, it's this thing called dissociative disorder.
Yes,
it's what happens when you're molested as a child. You create the kid that gets fucked. And then you create the kid that can get out of bed and walk around and pretend life's good.
And they're not connected.
And part of the therapy is like inviting that 3-year-old kid back into your life and forgiving her and healing her, or whatever. But those, it's no wonder that he experienced you as a bit schizophrenic.
Yes. It's so true. It's so true. And because I was experiencing myself that way. And there's people, and that I'm getting all kinds of personal revelation here, Cass. That explains why I could not be in the same room with people who didn't understand why I was with him. Because I was so married, like I didn't know who I was outside of who people thought I was. Like my identity was so based on other people's perception that if someone didn't like it, and if someone, I had a friend when I came back and we were prepping to lead worship, at church that day, and we're doing the sound checks, and she's like, "How was Europe?" I'm like, "It's great. I'm in love." And I was just like, "Oh my God, that's amazing. What church does he go to?" Like, and I said, "Oh, he doesn't." And she went, and she said, "Oh, but he's a Christian, right?" I said, No, he's not a Christian. And she gasped, hands over the mouth, and she said, "Just don't marry him or have sex with him." And at the time, I knew where she was coming from, but I just thought, man, you blew it. You really blew it.
It's so important for us to continue to challenge our perspective. Traveling does that for you sort of automatically, but the church and organized religion tend to discourage you. You stay in that bubble, don't change your perspective. And that makes it easier to stay within that. And when you do change your perspective, whether you're exposing yourself to new people or new places or new cultures, it kind of forces you to rethink who you are, and what you believe. So, I think that's something we have to do for ourselves. It will not happen automatically.
Oh gosh. And constantly, you can't
Yes.
just have that one time you did that thing, that made you a better person. You've got to continually bring those opportunities and take hold of them. And I think that's what messed with my mind so much was, telling people this great news, this joyous news. I am 32 and I found a guy that gets it, like that gets all of it, that loves all of it. Like, I'm so excited. And I remember telling another woman that we had a ministry with, a convalescent home ministry, and her daughter was sitting on her lap. And when I got to the part about him not being a Christian, I laugh now, but I cried for about 2 weeks because her daughter was someone that really looked up to me. She covered her daughter's ears.
Oh, that's tough.
Okay, so I got a metaphor. This is strange. Well, it could be the game, just hiding something, and then the hot and cold thing. So like, you're getting warmer, you're getting colder, or whatever. Or I'm in this room we're in, there's some blinds here on the wall, and imagine going over to the blinds, and that the other person that you're looking to for direction and identity and validation and even personality. You got with your hands, you've got a hold of the blind changer, adjuster, and you're looking over your shoulder at them. And so you raise it a little bit, and they nod or they shake their head no, or a little higher, and you're looking to their face. So the countenance that changed when that other worship leader, co-musician, when her countenance sunk at the revelation of, okay, number one, he doesn't go to church. Number two, he's not a Christian. And she went from like, how was your Europe trip and celebrating with you to now she's disappointed. And because you don't have any personal agency, you're like, oh, I shouldn't be seeing him. And you get your cues from other people. Yeah. And that's really tragic.
Well, and that's so much of that even is just, you just grow up in a big family, that's kind of part and parcel. But I remember I had enough, and this is where I was so glad the story was as good as it was, because it was enough to hold on to. Because at the time, I feel differently now, but at the time, I just kept showing everyone the story and saying, only God could have done this. Only God could have done this. And I remember telling them, the night that we had our I love you talk, I said, I've really had to wrestle with how this is okay, but I can't see how God didn't bring us together. So if God's okay with it, I can be okay with it. Yeah. That's all I had to stand on, but it was enough. And now I have more to stand on.
Well, there's scriptures where God told people to do something that seemed counterintuitive. I mean, I think we can use Abraham was supposed to kill his son. And you're like, God would never do that, but yet this is God. And, so there's no word of knowledge or meaning making that within the confines of Christianity that you can't justify by scripture. I mean,
golly. And that in and of itself is, I think, one of the most toxic.
Yeah, that's the gaslighting
aspects. Is that, what is it? I actually looked up this verse before our talk because I was thinking, okay, what verse to me is the linchpin of this is not helpful to humanity? And it was that ideas inspired by God are untouchable. That the idea, not just the action, but the idea, the thought, if God inspired it, you can't touch it. And that, what was it? The person without the Spirit doesn't accept the things that come from the Spirit, but considers them foolishness, and can't understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit.
Yeah.
Like that thought that.
Circular reasoning.
Oh, right. Well, not at the time. I mean, it made perfect sense. But now as an outsider outside of the bubble, like, damn it, you fuckers, you can't, that's not playing fair. You can't use that reasoning.
Because I said so.
That's not fighting fair. It doesn't give anyone else a chance.
Well, and just the level of coincidence it was that he was going to be in Berlin that time. That's got to be God.
Yeah.
It's got to be.
Yeah.
A fun fact, too, is my mom ended up coming with me for the first couple of weeks because my grandma, what was going to be my own backpacking trip, I brought my mom along. And we had a blast. And the last 5 days of her time in Europe coincided with when we met up with him. And she fell in love with him first. I mean, as a mother-son relationship, obviously, but they just adored each other. And I got to know him because I'd pretend to fall asleep on the train when we were traveling, and they would just be talking about their families, their upbringing, what they believed, what their home was like, and their politics, and just as though they had instantly become the best of friends. And so here's my Christian homeschooling mother of 6 who sewed our uniforms for homeschooling, who,
so funny.
sang hymns with us in the morning and taught me, and took us to convalescent homes to minister to the elderly and all these wonderful things. Here she is, just absolutely falling in love with this, quote unquote heathen, because she recognized his character and she recognized who he was. And so I don't think he would have had a chance past all of my walls and my mental blocks if she hadn't have fallen in love with him first.
Yeah.
And I didn't see him through that lens.
Yeah.
Because I was so closed off. That's not even an option.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I know I was so steeped in Christianity that when I began to have suspicions and observations that this is evil, there was a part of me that just knew, no, that can't be.
Yeah.
And part of the gravitas of that argument was all the cathedrals around the world, all the music written by Bach, just the depth of Christianity, the hugeness of a church on every corner, the billions of dollars spent erecting buildings in the name of this God and this Bible and this Jesus. And I just thought, it's me that's wrong. And what I'm seeing, the evil that I'm seeing and the counterproductivity that I see, that its effect on society is toxic. That can't be true. I'm crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's the gaslighting.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's so you don't have to imprison someone if you can get them to believe that they can't ever get free.
That's the finesse pimp.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's the big takeaway on this show, man. That was gold.
That was gold.
Oh.
So let's wrap it up with this. But you mentioned how many of your trips were accompanied by libations. What's your favorite?
Oh, right now it's just a good dirty martini.
With an
I
olive?
love a good dirty martini.
Yeah.
And then because it's California and it's starting to warm up a little bit, a sparkling rosé at the end of the day with dinner you can't go wrong.
Nice.
You know what? One of my favorite things to do, I'm not a wine drinker per se, but I love to eat dark chocolate, and while it's still in my mouth, chase it with port.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's a mouth orgasm for me.
That's a good moment. You're winning.
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 Well, and that goes back to like the scientific accident that life is that something as simple pleasure as chocolate and port in your mouth is just magical.
Yeah. Just let it be. Let it be what it is. Let it be magical.
Say yes to what is. All right.
Yeah.
All right, Nicole. Well, how do you feel about our talk? You got anything you want to say in closing?
It's funny. No, I'm just grateful. I'm grateful for a place where people can, because I'm such a verbal processor. So to be able to hear other people's stories, I'm grateful for so many people that just had the gumption to kind of stand up and go, this is happening to me too. And you're not crazy and you're not alone. It's really helped because even though I am not lonely, this is a lonely road. And it's a lonely journey, and it's there's a lot of mental and emotional loneliness to it. So hearing other voices, hearing other people, regardless of where they are in the journey, has been, I think, has made this much more bearable than it could have been.
Yeah. Well, today you're that person.
Yeah.
You're the one with the gumption today. So I appreciate it. And, some people say, and this may or may not happen for you, but you're going to get off the phone here with this. And life just changed because you planted a flag today on the World Wide Web.
Yeah.
It's out there now.
Yeah. Well, I actually haven't. No, and I'm not as scared now as I thought I would be.
Good.
And I have a couple of friends I've been wanting to talk to about it. And I thought, well, let me do this first.
Well, then you can just refer them to the podcast.
Hey, I got something I want you to listen to.
Yeah, I actually have an old friend from church that I got back in touch with who I told him I was doing this, and it was real hard to tell him, but I did. And he said, "Great, send me the link. I can't wait to listen." And that was a good moment.
Yeah, and if he can muster the courage to listen, that'll be, these are paradigm shifts. That's what I was thinking about when you got into Europe and you were kind of free, is that the neural pathways of our brain, are big ruts. And in the Sacramento, Nicole, and there's this neuroplasticity that starts happening when you're in Berlin. And then all of a sudden it's like, there's a whole
another dimension to me.
Well, I remember I kept just walking around Europe singing that song from Aladdin. A
whole new world.
Yeah. Because it felt like that. It just felt like, God, life is bigger. Life is so much bigger. And I think that's what I just kept taking away from this. And even from listening to the podcast, because part of my job, I can't help but make friends with the worst case scenario, is that thought that, what if we're all wrong? What if there is a God? And what if, despite all odds, it just happens to be, out of the thousands of options, it just happens to be the Jesus of Nazareth that the Western world largely worships.
Yeah.
Out of all of them, what if that just happens to be it? And everything in the Bible is literally accurate. And we've all, all this journey of self-discovery and self-awareness and self-evolution and self-compassion. What if all of that is wrong and evil? And so taking that worst case scenario and go, you know what? I'd still take it. I'd still be where I am. I'd still take this journey that I'm on and the conclusions that I've come to, because I would rather not believe in a God that's real than believe that God is actually who's been in charge of everything. Because I've watched too many children die. Yeah. And I've watched too many parents with unanswered prayers for too long. Statistically speaking, the sample size is too great to believe that God is a good God.
Yeah. Well, Nicole, you've been a great guest, and this is fantastic story. I just appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Thank you, Cass. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
So Nicole was from California, giving us her story. Loved it.
Yep. Her perspective is so interesting, witnessing what she does as a nurse. And then I think it's cool because she has the perspective of the way she grew up. She's able to kind of see outside herself a little bit, and that allowed her to be more aware of what had happened to her and what she's going through.
I wouldn't say her ability to see outside herself she got from her Christian upbringing, but she got it from
the openness of her parents, that they were able to do that. That gave her a little bit of a wedge, into being able to open that up. I think if people who have families and their whole bubble is completely closed in, it's harder for them to open that door and more traumatic. I can relate to that because you have that perspective of, I know how it's like to be that way, but I can also be outside of that and see that. So you can be sort of compassionate, not angry about it.
Yeah. And a chameleon in a way.
Yeah.
You can play both fields. One of the things that's going to be refreshing about right at the opening of the show, a lot of the guests and people that listen to this show, their siblings, it's caused a rift. Uh-huh. Their departure from faith has caused a deep, painful rift in the family. And to hear her siblings say, we really
glad to have you back.
Glad to have you back. I mean, that's the opposite.
Yeah.
And what a dream that would be for our siblings and everybody. Even if they're a little out in front, they're not going to condescend. I mean, they could. But they're just saying, this is the real you, and you are beautiful, and it's good to see you. What
validation.
Yeah. What about that pimp thing?
Oh, my gosh. That was the thing in this that just sort of, I wrote it. I was like, sex trafficking as a metaphor for religion or for Christianity, that it is more dangerous in some ways to be
finessed.
I guess I was finessed. I kept thinking of the way predators groom children, pedophiles who will make friends, and that it's a gradual thing so that they don't even realize that they've been molested. But that's actually scarier. I kept thinking of this analogy to racism, and I mean, I teach a lot. We read a lot of texts about racism and how there's that overt racism of just name calling and lynching, but that the more dangerous is the type that is
under the radar.
That's under the radar, or that even the people who are doing it don't realize they're doing it. You know, that these small microaggressions. And there was something in the that she said, and I couldn't remember to go back to it, but when something is wrong and the society is wanting to do it, there has to be this effort made to keep, religion has to keep proving itself over and over again. And I was thinking about Jim Crow laws, and when I teach this unit, and there's a whole bunch of excerpts of all these crazy laws that got passed during that period of, you can't go to the circus together, and you can't play baseball together, and the sandlot has to be,
water fountains.
And they're so specific. They're, really specific in all these states. And I have my students read it, and I'm like, why do we make laws? Well, because people are doing the opposite. It's like it's fighting nature, that we had to keep coming up with more ways to keep people apart, because if they get together, it was when she was talking about meeting the boyfriend, and once you interact with someone who's not in the faith, you're like, oh, and he's not terrible. In fact, he's pretty awesome.
And there was a lot of natural and instinctive going on. And yet
you're like, wait a minute, this isn't supposed to be the way it is. So, all those laws were made because the people in charge knew that if whites and blacks did go to the circus together or play baseball together or, eat at the same table, that they might make friends, and then they might, discover that they don't hate each other. And then what's going to happen to the whole setup?
Yeah. Well, what we're saying is that innately, like little kids don't have any sense of wrongness about playing baseball with somebody of a different color,
so you have a different religion.
So you have to impose that from the outside,
right?
Yeah, and it's true of good laws too. Like maybe we don't necessarily have. Some people have an internal compass that says it's bad to steal, but there are those that don't, and so we have to make a law. Yeah, and what you just said made me think of Trump, because the church has to continue to evolve with things. Now, in a bad way, that's the Trump thing. But in a good way, I don't even know if it's good or bad. That's binary. Sorry about that. But when evolution came along, and it was kind of undoubtable,
right?
They basically had to say, well, there is a passage in the Bible that says a day is like 1,000 years. So there's this.
We're going to continue to make this fit. It's
because
still true.
Yeah, God and creation can coexist with what we know to be true as far as a billion-year planet, and it's almost like they have to
evolve.
They have to evolve with it, but they have to. Alter the engine, or they have to do something that says, okay, we're going to co-opt it for one thing. We're going to latch on to it, because otherwise we're going to be deemed irrelevant.
It's like holidays, right? So they, had to take pagan Easter and be like, yeah, that's ours. That's about, because otherwise people were going to get mad that they couldn't keep celebrating their holiday they really liked. So just sort of fitting, what was it I read? I mean, there are a lot of these things, but some little, at Christmas time, the candy cane that someone said, it was made that way to be a J for Jesus. And I'm like, no, it wasn't. No, that's not true at all. You just made that up, you know?
Well, because of this, I'm going to jump to this, but because of the schizophrenia of the Bible, meaning you got one passage that's really strong emphasis on be ye holy, just as I am holy, and God loves obedience, and the straight and narrow, and dot your I's and cross your T's, be disciplined in your faith. Without works, faith is dead. There's this emphasis on legalism. And then you have these passages where God chose David, who was an adulterer, to be king and to be a man after God's own heart. So God's loving and impressed and pleased with an adulterer. And, the irony or the absurdity of God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son.
Yeah.
Well, why would God do that? Well, God is going to do what he wants, and if you are in step, in sync with that, then you're going to go with God. Well, so what that contradiction and that diversity of direction from the Bible does to, in a schizophrenic way is you can justify anything. And so
you're on your toes always. You don't know.
And going back to your subtle racism that's under the radar, here's Obama, fucking family values to the fucking core. Like nobody, probably one of the most faithful presidents out of 44. He epitomizes Christian values. He even claims to be a Christian. And yet there's this suspicion of him. He's a Muslim, that he's not a U.S., he's not born in the U.S. He's, this just suspicion, like really watching him under the microscope. I don't trust this guy. And so for the world that's watching, I mean, just talk about a secular person that's not a believer. They're an American. They've been watching America and Christianity evolve for 50 years. And they've figured out that Jesus is about love. Jesus is about do unto others. Jesus is about righteousness. He's about fidelity. And they get it. How confounded are they, that type of person right now?
Yeah.
After they've watched that group of people really distrust Obama. And yet here comes a guy who overtly, boastfully is a pervert. He's a horrible human being. And he's the literally antithesis and opposite of Jesus. And they don't have any distrust of him.
Yeah. It depends on what bubble you're in. And I think that it's like people can take scripture and twist it to make it fit with what they need to. And I think that, it depends on what you're listening to and what you're exposing yourself to in terms of that narrative. And they've heard a different story about Obama, and they've heard a different story.
But it's racism.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's what's underlying it.
Yeah.
And, political will, you don't want, they're not doing things that are going to be good for them. So they're going to create this narrative. But it's amazing how the mind works and how it can be, it's so suggestible.
Yeah. Well, think about their linchpin issue is abortion. And yet they can't, not only can they not proof text that, find a scripture that makes it as big a priority as they've made it. The Bible's full of abortion. God doing it. Killing babies in the womb or making women fertile or whatever.
Right.
And the preciousness and what they call the sacredness of life is not in the Bible.
Right. There's a lot of killing.
A lot of killing by God. And, so anyway, this is part of that mystery I was talking about in the show, where as a Christian 20 years ago, I believed it. God was my best friend. Jesus was my Savior. And yet I would get these notions of, I think this is evil. And yet I couldn't allow myself to go there because of, that's, nobody else believes that. I have to be wrong.
Must be me.
Yeah, it's me. And so I was gaslit by that. And just to give oneself permission to finally go, nope, I trust myself. And that's really the theme of Nicole's testimony, is I started to trust myself, and that's made all the difference. And I ended up saying this to a couple at a bar last night, because they were, we got to talking about religion. The poor bartender, he's like, I've heard this is the main conversation at bars.
Interesting.
And I just told him, I said, look, if I get to heaven and there's a judgmental God, I'm ready to stand before him right now more than I've ever been. Yeah. Especially if he's a good God. If he's an asshole, fuck him and send me to hell. It's what she said. If it's true, if what we're doing is wrong, I'd still be doing it because I believe in it. And at the end of the day, this is why I say atheism is the best practice of theism, is at the end of the day, if God is as good is, according to our moral compass, then absolutely ready to stand before God, shoulders high, chin up, and say, go ahead,
the right thing.
Bring your best.
I saw a photo someone had put on Facebook of a sign, probably at one of these marches, that said who all was going to hell. Had the list of homos and atheists and I don't remember, all these
feminists,
trans people, all that. Yeah. And she was like, as a former student, she said, hell is going to be lit. I can't wait till the fun people are going to be there.
Yeah. The Rolling Stones will be there.
Yeah. I thought of something else when you were talking too about this sort of inconsistency in the Bible of all these different versions of God and like which one's watching and who is it. And now I can't think of what it is. And we're studying it in literary criticism about, not Bettelheim, like the prison metaphor where you don't know if there's someone in the watchtower or not, but there might be at all times. And so how that, do you know what I'm talking about? It's not Derrida. It's one of these theorists.
Oh no. Yeah.
It's a philosopher, but Starts with B. I'll have to look it up. But that's part of it, the fear of it might be this God that loves you and wants you to, or it might be the one that's really jealous. It might kill you, might kill your mom. And it's just, you can't really know which one. So
which is why fancy white guys get the power that they get, because tell me what to think.
Yeah.
Groupthink, sheeple, safety in numbers.
He said so. I did what my pastor said.
And I needed somebody to say so because I'm confused. It's, and
which is why what we're doing and what Nicole is saying is so important, because if you hear someone else say, hey, the emperor has no clothes, and kind of think that then you're like, oh, okay, well, then maybe I'm not crazy.
I thought he was naked long ago. And this is why, the perspective of yourself and Bob and others that, again, gave it up quick are like, oh, yeah, welcome to the human race.
I had a thought recently. I was thinking about so I don't know, I haven't thought this through, but that Paul's, the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 13 that everybody reads.
Love chapter.
That's where he says, when I was a child, I spake as a child, understood as a child. And I always have reflected on that. I'm like, so that is telling us that we have to change, that the way we think has to change. And so sometimes maybe I'm like, this is confirmation bias too, but I look back at all the time I spent as a child and as a teenager, drinking the Kool-Aid or whatever. And it was a safe and loving bubble for me. Maybe it was a necessity that I go through the process I did. I had the college I went to was a small liberal arts college. And to me, of course, it was incredibly liberal because it wasn't a Church of Christ school. But one of my roommates, who was much more progressive, she said, oh, no, it was very conservative. I'm like, no, it's perspective coming from where I was. Maybe that was the that was the stair step I needed to be like, oh, there's more out here. And then, and that's why I had sort of this gradual, soft, lifting.
It's probably true of everybody. Maybe some faster than others or whatever, but it has to be gradual.
Well, when you're a little kid, there's also a necessity of understanding things in a simple way, that we use simple language and we don't explain complicated things when kids are 3 and 4. And so we gradually approach that. So maybe we as humans need, and now I'm thinking of like the whole history of the human race, maybe we needed these supernatural explanations to help us deal, and that it feels like we're experiencing a sea change. This next generation, so many kids are not religious or not at all exposed to any religion. And of course, a lot of people think that's horrible, but maybe that's just the natural progression of things, that we are as a species overcoming the need for that. And so rather than looking back and thinking, oh, we were
shaming
so silly
ourselves.
And so stupid, that was
I totally agree, and I love this macro look of just like the life of a single child at 3 years old, at 5 years old, and for example, training wheels, and then take the wheels off and you can ride the bike, and that kid doesn't, or the parents even don't look at that and say, I can't believe that you use training wheels.
Yeah,
no, it served its purpose, and I absolutely believe evolutionarily that the meaning-making, storytelling, pattern-seeking creature. Those were the ones that survived.
Yeah.
Because guess what happened to the others? They committed suicide. I mean, nihilism
figure it out.
Nihilism is a real pitfall to atheism, because if you don't, it can be very daunting that there's no reason to get out of bed. And the unconsciousness actually sounds superior to consciousness. And so they check out, or they just, they're just not self-aware. They're not, or they're not as engaged to hear that tiger in the weeds, and so I totally agree that religion and master narratives and even immortality projects keep us going, keep us happy. It's compartmentalization. In some ways, it's head in the sand denial and delusion,
But we can forgive ourselves the way we forgive a child for believing, whatever silly thing they believe about nature or science and stuff before they we all had, Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy.
Yeah.
Of course, those are simplistic things. It becomes a problem when people still hang on to that when they shouldn't know better.
Right. Or a pacifier. You have that oral fixation still, and yet you're not nursing, but this is going to be that transitional thing that we're going to eventually take away. But right now you need it. I don't know. But I've used that before. I think religion is a pacifier. I think it's a security blanket. I think it's training wheels.
We have sex trafficking. We have pacifiers. We have all these analogies.
Adjusting the blinds.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's the only way you can talk about something like this. It's abstract. That's why we have figures of speech to talk about difficult, abstract topics.
Well, thanks for co-hosting. This was fun.
My pleasure. Yeah. Lots of fun. I learned some things.